Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I would like to talk about the books that I read a decade ago. Yes, we are going back to January 2015. Now, if you remember, throughout the entirety of last year, I was looking at the books that I had read in 2014 and seeing if I could remember any of them, or indeed share any anecdotes, or if my tastes had changed. And I can guarantee my tastes have changed since the books that I read in 2015. For some context about this year, my manager had recently been sacked from the charity shop I was working at the time, and thus I was not necessarily doing overtime there, but my weeks were held up by the charity shop. I also know that this was the year that our Doris came out, so I might have been working on part of the novel in the beginning of the year, but things didn't properly kick off with that book until my friend Joy Winkler invited me to Knutsford Library and told them I had a book coming out, which I hadn't got planned at all, and so this year fewer books were read. Started the year with a reread, which was Children of the Lamp, Volume 1, The Akhenaten Adventure by P.B. Kerr. The Children of the Lamp books were released when I was at high school. It's about two children who find out that they are descended from jinn, like genies. And it's been 10 years since I read this book, which means it's been 20 years probably since I read the book for the first time. And when I was younger, I really appreciated these magical twins who are a bit richer, and how the magic was based on luck and the different tribes and the different tales of mythology. And I can remember rereading it. I didn't realise it had been 10 years since I read it until I looked. And I remember reading this. I remember rereading this, reading it for the second time and thinking, my goodness, this character is racist. And I had not realised this character was racist. So they end up going to India in the first book, or Egypt. It could be Egypt. But basically, they go off to foreign climes from America, and one of the side characters is incredibly racist. He won't sample any of the food and will only eat baby food due to his proclivities. And there were just certain things that said in this book that I think were definitely a product of their time. And at the time when I was reading this, I was reading it because I was working on the children's book. I thought I'd like this book. I would read something different than the usual children's books that I was reading. And I was going to read the entire series because for me, the first three books are great. And then I don't own the final book in the series. And the next 4 or 5 books are awful. There's one book where things finally amped up in tension, and I thought, I'm glad it's going in this direction. And then the book all gets reset to the start again, and the characters did not experience anything they experienced in the book. And I've always said that book makes no sense then, because you could have got away without us having to read it at all, because the characters don't learn anything because everything resets to the way the book was at the start. Weirdly, the books are still on my shelves. I don't know why. Maybe part of me thinks they're going to be worth something one day. They probably won't be. They'll probably be forgotten. Then we have Miss Marvel, Volume 1, No Normal. I really enjoyed this when I read it. I have since sold it. I don't own any of the Miss Marvel graphic novel collections that I got at the time, because basically Marvel sprang off and sent Miss Marvel into all these different comic books, and I couldn't cope with it, and I wasn't prepared to go finding all of her stories everywhere. I've not watched the show. I haven't watched the film, and trying to see what my tastes were. I was reading a lot more comic books and graphic novels back then. And honestly, I think it was just to fill up a number in my journal. I then read Pretty Deadly, Volume 1. I think I still own this. I don't know. I don't remember it. This was the year that I was moving away from young adult fiction, and I was moving away from what people were commonly talking about on YouTube, but I was also still trying to read things that I thought were popular at the time. And I kept seeing a lot about Miss Marvel, and I thought it would be great to read a comic book character from the beginning and get to see their origins without having to have all this history behind them because she's going to be new. I then read Mud, Muck and Dead Things. I also read The Inspector and Mrs. Jeffries, whose author I can't remember, and The Mermaids Singing. I mentioned all of these 3 books because they were the final 3 books I read that month. I only read 6 books in January 2015. Was like struggling with ideas as to where I'd go to once I'd finished Doris. And so I was looking at crime fiction. I think I must have got in the mood for crime fiction and was wondering whether I would write Alice Valentine. I know that I got plans to introduce Alice in one of the stories, and I definitely wrote a page where she met her auntie for coffee in a cafe, but it never went anywhere. And Mud, Muck and Dead Things is more of a cosy crime, as is The Inspector and Mrs. Jeffries. I didn't much care for Mud, Muck and Dead Things, but I did like the idea that it was set in a central community. That didn't inspire Alice, and I don't actually remember much more of that book, and I haven't gone on to read any of the others in that series. I've talked a lot about going back and reading more from The Inspector and Mrs. Jeffries. That series is, I think it's Victorian or Edwardian era, and Mrs. Jeffries is like the head housekeeper at this house that the inspector owns, and she gets all the other staff within this house to solve the crimes for the inspector so that they can go on earning their wages and they're not out of a job which would ruin their lives as well as ruining the inspectors. So I liked the idea behind it, and it definitely added to the sense of coziness and gave it more of a sense of peril that was there. But I found these books funny. Well, I say these books, I found this book funny, and keep talking about how one day I'll go back. But you know, it's been 10 years. Why do I keep saying that? And The Mermaids Singing, like, part of me thinks that was Val McDermid, but I don't know. If it is Val McDermid, I did not remember ever having read that author. I'm going to have to look this book up because I have no memory of it and was really shocked to see it here. But if it was the Val McDermid, I'd always been interested in reading a book by this author because they had been featured in the Woman's Weekly alongside Veronica Stallwood, and they wrote crime and are really at the top of their genre. So maybe that's why I read it. I swear this is a bit like the style of 90s gritty crime novel that I'm not a fan of, or at least I wasn't a fan then and I haven't gone and tried them again since. I liked Ian Rankin, but I don't think they're on a par with one another. I think Val McDermid's a bit more, not intellectual, but very much goes into the psyche of the characters, and I feel like it's a bit more insular and there's a bit more graphic content in there. It's a bit more gruesome, and she doesn't mind harming people in her prose. And them's the books. I'm looking ahead at 2015 here and seeing all of the young adult titles that I'd forgotten that I'd read, which is interesting, and I might continue to do this for the remainder of 2025. Who knows? We will see. If you've read any of the books that I have talked about today and would like to discuss them, then please feel free to do so in the comments. I hope that you have enjoyed this video because, until next time, that is all.